Good evening. So these are our alchemists. I've drawn all sorts of little alchemical sigils and symbols for you. If you know what they are, then you can be sitting back feeling safe and secure. If you don't know what they are, don't feel nervous and strange. I'll explain them before we're through tonight. But before doing that, we're going to start out with some general discussion of alchemy and its history, and then tie that up into the Kabbalah through some comparisons. And in the second half, we'll get into some practical usages of how these very archaic, arcane methods of self-development can be applied today with beneficent results. Alchemy, like the Kabbalah and Tarot and a half a dozen other esoteric traditions, is not capable of dating in its origin. We have no idea where it originates. Some say that alchemia, means the dark science from the original name of Egypt, Chem. Others say that Chem actually means eye in the old Egyptian, and that therefore it is the science of seeing, or the all-seeing eye, that sort of thing. In fact, we really don't know. All of these different attributions, according to etymology, are fanciful. If you dig into your dictionaries, you quickly discover that the words being attributed don't really exist, that the Greeks were not aware of that particular spelling and didn't have that particular meaning. So what you really have are historians and writers on alchemy who are symbolizing something to us in these names. When they say that Egypt was called Chem, the dark land, they're simply saying that this art was a fertile art, because Egypt was called the dark land because of the darkness of its soil, and that they believe that it originated in Egypt, perhaps with Hermes Trismegistus. Others say that alchemy is purely a localized phenomenon, that there was a Chinese alchemy, a Hindu alchemy, and a European alchemy, completely unconnected, that they were a kind of a mad little brother, or rather even mother, let's say, mad mother of chemistry. That this was a period when superstition was rife, the Aristotelian influence of the church was still strong, and therefore people thought that if it made sense here, it would make sense in the world. It was physical and actual, if it was mental. And only through many years of mistakes and strange experimentation did they finally discover that there was no mystical side to alchemy. There was only chemistry and superstition. And superstition was finally removed in favor of chemistry. When we go back into some of the histories that have been written of late about alchemy, what we discover is there's a kind of cultural bias against the belief that these people were attempting any kind of psychological or spiritual self-understanding in these studies. Carl Jung is a notable exception. He wrote several tremendous works in which he had a rather strange conception of alchemy as being a kind of unconscious searching for the soul, or a symbolization of inner searching in outer searching. In other words, the chemical experimentation of the early alchemists was a projection of their inward searching. And he felt that perhaps one or two alchemists were aware of this and left little hints in their writings about that, but that on the whole, alchemists were not aware of that. This is possible. The problem, of course, is that we're dealing here with an incredibly impacted symbology, particularly in the European tradition. The reason for that is rather interesting. Alchemy appears about the same time that Rosicrucianism does. It predates it just a little bit, but since there is a great deal of question as to whether Rosicrucianism may have been around about 100 or 200 years at least before it actually makes an appearance, it could be that they originated together. In addition, there are many little statements in alchemical tracts, similar to those in the Rosicrucian tracts, of the adepts having traveled in Spain or far away in the East. In other words, in the Islamic countries. Spain at that time was Moorish. So the idea was that alchemy, in some sense, was brought from Islam back into Europe. With Paracelsus, we find the first really great exponent of alchemy, and we might add also of medicine. He was supposed to have gone and traveled in Turkey and in the East and to have gotten a great deal of his information from Islam. But on the other hand, he decided that he would have to walk among the people, among the witches, among the herbalists, and discover what kind of methods they had for healing, what their traditions were like. And then he correlated some of these systems with what he had found in the East and with what he also found in his own experimentations and his own mystical experience. He was not a very popular man, and it's thought that he was murdered by the medical practitioners of his day, because he used to like to go out and take their favorite textbooks and burn them in front of the universities and say to his students, "This is the only good use of these textbooks." Alchemy was, in other words, an aspect of Protestantism. Rosicrucianism was part of the kind of revolutionary movement away from the Catholic Church, the Catholic influence. And alchemy was a sense of trying to seek out salvation by oneself, without a priest there, without the church telling you exactly what you must believe and what you must do. And the idea was based on an old Hermetic axiom that dated back perhaps to Neoplatonism, but perhaps even further back to Egypt, as above, so below. That if you could find certain correspondences in nature, you could find them perhaps within, so that natural experimentation, physical experimentation, would be very useful as a means of discovering truths about the self. So these alchemists used the very complex chemical symbology, and I might add that there is no common symbology. What I've drawn here on the right is some of the more popular attributions, but you'll see that I've got a division in the elements here on the right, which I'll explain later, simply because nobody agreed on what the symbology was. You've got literally thousands of different symbological systems from that period. Each author was trying to express these things in his own way, in his own language. And each author was using this involved secret language for a very simple reason, and that was despite the fact that Luther came along and said that the Catholic Church was a bad influence and it was destroying Christianity and all that, and struck a tremendous blow against the Church, we still had very, very intolerant Christians at that period in the Protestant nations. You had a lot of wars going on between factions of Christianity, Catholic and Protestant. A person who came out with heretical beliefs that weren't approved of by Luther or the Catholic Church, were still in very great danger. So you have the example of Jacob Boehme, who wrote really beautiful mystical books on Christianity, where he interpreted the Old Testament in particular in terms of just beautiful inner motions and discoveries. Very difficult to read, didn't have tremendous influence, but nevertheless was chased and harassed his whole life by the clergy in the area that he lived, and eventually was denied burial in the city he was born in because he was considered to be a heretic. Now, you can imagine what happens when an alchemist comes along, and he's not particularly interested in the Bible as such. In fact, the parts that he's interested in and the way he's interested in them are considered to be a little bit off color. He likes the Song of Solomon, and he finds all kinds of sexual influences in it, and he feels that the sex act is perhaps the greatest symbol of this process of enlightenment. So he's going to prattle on about the Song of Solomon and about certain psalms that have strong sexual content, and he's going to make a lot of enemies in the process. Wiser, then, to develop some sort of language that the church is not going to notice, or at least that they may not understand if they do notice it. And that way you can publish your materials. People of like mind will contact you. So, for example, if you were an alchemist and you picked up a book by Raymond Lull at a time when he was still alive, and you looked at his symbology, and you didn't get all of it, but you got enough that you said, this fellow has something here, I want to understand it. You would make the effort to go search out Raymond Lull. You would perhaps find him, and he would instruct you in what you didn't understand, and perhaps you would instruct him as well. And so we have an interesting and rather quaint phenomenon in these early books. And that is that you'll find at the end of them a statement that says, the author of this tract, and of course after that he puts in all the stuff about his is the only wise tract, and all the other tracts are by fools and ruffians and this sort of thing, lives at such and such an address. And anyone interested in further instruction should come there and contact him. Now you can imagine an author today doing something like that. He'd be involved in a deluge. But at that time, you could still do that. There wasn't sufficient interest. And in fact, in certain books, Francis Barrett's book, for example, we find the statement that he'll be at such and such a corner in such and such a city on such and such a time, and that if you want instruction in magic or Kabbalah, to meet him there at that time, and you'll get it. So we had a very different kind of picture. Publishing was very different in those days. Some of the books had a tremendously involved system of chapters with all this confusing, contradictory stuff, and some great plates. And the plates were the whole message. They were like little mandalas. All you had to do was pay attention to them, and they unfolded all of the system. The chapters in between was a lot of gobbledygook put in there to confuse people. And as I've mentioned before in magical texts, the idea was that if you didn't have the brains to figure it out, well, have fun trying to figure it out. Eventually you'll get frustrated and either look at the pictures or throw the whole thing away, and they'll figure that you weren't supposed to be involved in it in the first place. And they warn you right away. They say, this stuff sounds like it's foolishness, but you must be patient. They say you must pray for guidance. You must be humble. You must keep at it. And it may take years and years and years and years and years and years and years, and eventually you'll get it. And now how they get it and what they get will be the next part of our discussion. What they're looking for is the philosopher's stone, or alternatively, they're looking for gold. Now, of course, in most histories of chemistry, that's what we hear about. And in schools, that's what we hear about when we hear about alchemy. These were a bunch of crazy guys who went out trying to make gold. Symbolism. Gold appears in every major religious and mystical tradition as a symbol of enlightenment. The reason being that of all metals, it's the most like the sun. And the sun is the most symbolic thing we have of God, and therefore the analogy is good, as above, so below. There were unquestionably many alchemists who were working to make gold. But the great alchemists, Raymond Lulls and Paracelsus and Agrippa, and these people always say, beware if you are interested in this science, in this art, out of greed, because this art will destroy you. There are constant warnings about that. On the other hand, even these alchemists made little statements to the effect that, yes, they had seen the transubstantiation of lead to gold. And there are little reports here and there cherished by alchemists that such and such a king or such and such a duke witnessed the transmutation of lead into gold, and that, in fact, this king had heaping coffers of alchemist gold, and that's the way he was able to maintain his kingdom and that sort of thing. We don't really know whether that's true or not. Rumor has it that there's a museum in Europe, I don't know which one it is, that has a coin that is part silver and part gold. And the story is that there is no way that it could have been made that way, that it had to have been transmutated. Could be. I haven't seen it myself, so I can't tell you. So there's definitely a possibility that alchemy would work, but if it did, it would be moving us into the field of magic somewhat, not because it would be something miraculous, but because magic is understood to deal with what we might call supernatural laws. Supernatural in the sense that they are unknown to us. They are natural, but because most of us live in a rather gross physical state, we are not aware of them. They're more refined laws. We have to bring them into our consciousness. And it is said that a magician, or anyone who is fully enlightened, is able to affect matter through the application of will and a certain orientation of mind. So perhaps it is possible that the alchemists could have figured out a process by which the molecular structure of a metal could be changed. Stranger things have happened. Now, we have this making gold, or the philosopher's stone. The philosopher's stone was a little bit different. It was supposed to heal everything. Healed you mentally, emotionally, bodily. It was the cure-all for any disease. And you sometimes found alchemists who had advertisements in the backs of their books that they had discovered the philosopher's stone and it was great for gout and that sort of thing. So there was some medical effort in this direction too. But again, think of the symbolism. First we have gold, symbolic of the sun, of the inner self of God. And we also have the philosopher's stone, a cure-all. And when they tell you that it cures all ills, now you have to start thinking deviously like an alchemist would. So the first thing you have to think of is, well, what are all ills? Well, there's physical ills, but an alchemist is interested in the spiritual as well. So that means that it's got to cure emotional and mental ills as well. And if you're a good metaphysician, you know that the only way you can cure all these ills is spiritually. The spirit must be made whole, must be completed. And then we have the philosopher's stone, the healing of all such inadequacies. Now also, think of the symbolism in terms of philosopher, meaning the lover of knowledge or friend of knowledge, and stone being foundation. So this is the foundation of the love of knowledge. And what is the foundation of the love of knowledge but knowledge itself, that which we find, or truth? So the idea, in a certain extent, in the alchemical quest is to find the truth. And the idea here is that the truth is not some abstract form, out there that you suddenly understand it. Now you're truly wise. The idea is that truth transforms, and that there are degrees of truth. So if you get this much truth, your life is this much transformed. If you get that much truth, well, it's that much transformed. And the more truth you get, the more transformation. And we can perhaps say that there's a certain point where if you get this much truth, you're no longer really human. So we say that's the philosopher's stone. You've achieved enlightenment, you've done the most you can do embodied, and you're ready to go on to the next level, whatever that might be, in this wonderful universe of ours. So what we have then is a record of this sort of questing for truth, using a very simple, grammatical almost symbology. Again, a lot of variations, but the general dynamic behind it is quite simple. And that's written over here on the right side of the board. Now I've put the Kabbalistic tree up too, because what we'll do is show how the Kabbalistic ladder, in a sense, is a more detailed examination of the same levels and elements. So first of all, for orientation, up at the top, number 1, we've got these 3 curves above Kether, the crown. And those 3 curves refer to Ein Sof, and Ein Sof Or, which are the 3 primal states before we actually reach the tree. And they can be described as Ein, no thing. That's just a simple statement, just can't know it. Completely outside of human comprehension. Can't say anything about it. Even to say that it's no thing is to say something, is to limit it. And then to remind us about this limitation, we have Ein Sof, which is the limitless, next step in this, the infinite. And then Ein Sof Or, the infinite light. Now, light in Hebraic traditions, including the Bible, can often be understood as consciousness. So you might think of that as infinite consciousness. And then we get down to Kether, which is actually the first point of individuation. But these 3, the number 1, correspond roughly to the alchemical Eitzoth or Atzoth. That can be described, Eliphas Levi described it as the astral light. It can be described basically as this unlimited spiritual reservoir. You can call it God if you like. You can call it just this beingness would be a way to put it. It's the unlimited completeness of things outside of individuation. And the idea is that Eitzoth is sort of the primal life force in these 3 elements of it, representations of it, these 3 that become a human being or any being in our universe, in our plane of existence. The next level, corresponding to the first triad in the Kabbalistic tree being Kether, the crown, the first point of individuation, the kind of the place where God touches you, the divine source, and Bina and Chokmah, going that way. So on the right, wisdom, and on the left, understanding, which are the active and passive states of the cosmic mind, let's put it that way. That corresponds to sulfurous, sulfur, or spirit. Now, in some systems, spirit is associated with fire. Paracelsus differs, and he's an important enough figure that I thought he should be included, his other version. He says that it's air. He associates spirit with air, and I suppose that he would then say that Eitzoth was fire, which is a pretty good symbology in itself. Now then the next 6 Sephiroth could be said to represent the areas of emotions and mind. This is sort of where we really live. Although we are in bodies and we think of things in terms of our bodies, it's kind of a locus of attention for us. We really live in our minds, our expectations, sensations, emotions, thoughts, our sense of selfhood and self-expression, our imagination, all that's included in here, and that's Mercurius or Mercury. And that has been designated as air, and in Paracelsus' system as water. Both work pretty well. And then finally we get down at the bottom of the tree to Malkuth, or the kingdom, which is the embodied physical world, and that corresponds with the alchemical salt, and that's earth and earth. That's one place where Paracelsus agrees. So, let's define the system in a little bit more basic sense. The alchemists talk about balancing these 3 elements. The first thing they say is that we never find any of them completely separate. Eitzoth permeates all of them. Sulfur has mercury and salt in it, but the sulfur is more present than the other 2. There's more of it. And the same is said of mercury and salt. So in a sense, there are 9 parts here And that leads us to 10 with Eitzoth, and that according, brings us into the Kabbalistic tree immediately and into the Pythagorean tetrad, a completeness. But what we're really dealing with here is a system of balancing. The alchemist takes his salt, his mercury, and his sulfur, mixes them in different proportions, and puts them over the alchemical fire. And there's all kinds of other elements like aqua fortis and all this that we won't go into because it would take forever. But we find that this is a process really of discovering these elements in ourselves and then balancing our awareness of them, our attention to them. So, for example, you have a person who is entirely bodily oriented, a salt person. This is a person who's very concerned with their physical appearance and with being in good shape, and they work hard on it, and they're very concerned with their diet and all that sort of thing. And all their attention is focused on the salt level, on the body level. As the alchemists tell us, there's mercury and sulfur there, and Eitzoth also. Eitzoth is the life force itself. There's spirit there, otherwise it would not be a living being. And mercury is there too. The mind, emotions, imagination are focused, however, on the body in this person. Now, let's say that person runs into a situation that brings their attention to the mind or the imagination. Maybe they read a book about the power of mind over matter, or they're running a race or lifting weights or something, and they suddenly discover that the difference of a thought helps them to be stronger at one point than at another. Maybe they run into William Blake's work somewhere, and they read that he says that imagination is the most important thing and is the very savior of humanity, and they start to think about it. All of a sudden the focus is shifting. Now, in some cases, they lose interest in the physical. They stop working so much with weights and that sort of thing. They begin to read books, perhaps, or do creative work. And they begin to explore their minds and their emotions and all that sort of thing. Now, again, body's still there, obviously. Spirit's still there. Life force, Eitzoth, is still there. And finally, if they go far enough with mercury, these days we don't get many doing this, they discover there's something else in there. There's a spiritual force. There is something that unites these various thoughts, emotions, and inclinations that arise. There's a kind of watcher, a consciousness, an individualized presence of being. And that is spirit. So now, let's say that you've got this idea. You've experienced these three levels, maybe even the fourth. The fourth level experience might be described as cosmic consciousness. What do you do with it? That's where the alchemists' recipes came in. Most often they told you, well, you mix 2 parts of this with 3 parts of that, 4 parts of this, and then turn up the fire. Don't turn it up too far, and don't keep it too low. Now, what do they mean by that? First of all, when we get to mathematical ratios, we're dealing with, 2 parts of mercury, 4 parts of sulfur, let's say, so be twice as aware of the spiritual as you are of the mental. If you want to divide your day up 24 hours, spend twice as many hours with attention on the spiritual than you do on the mental, that sort of thing. And now, as far as the fire is concerned, that's the fire of aspiration. If you turn it up too far, you burn up your mixture. In other words, you burn out. If you keep it too low, nothing ever boils together, nothing gels, there's no tension, there's no heat in the process. So, in a sense then, these are recipes for spiritual practice. And also, in a sense, they're guided meditations. Because as you're reading them, if you know the symbology, then you're picturing these various balances and states. The most important thing to realize, however, is that alchemy and alchemical tracts basically consist of a diary kind of history of these processes. These people are not writing on the basis of vast experience with thousands of people and their different associations with this. Basically, they're writing on their own experience and some reading they have done in the alchemical tradition. So they will, for instance, put together long records of quotations from earlier alchemists saying, aha, now these guys knew what they were talking about, and these are the sentences that I found most useful. What that really means is that these are the sentences that helped me to gain enlightenment, and therefore I pass them on to you. But you can see when you're dealing with perhaps 1,000, perhaps 10,000 different diaries, that you can't really find a system. You can't really boil this down to an easy step-by-step approach. You can definitely apply the ideas, the symbology, into your own life. That's quite useful. You can realize that there was, during this apparently spiritually dark period in European history, tremendous spiritual experimentation going on. But as far as looking for a specific technique, usually not there. It's possible that there are individuals who do find in certain books and devotees, for example, a recipe that really appeals to them strongly, and they follow that with some success, but that is definitely the exception. So what we have then is, due to the fear and the danger of writing about these matters in those times, the creation of a complex symbology that is perhaps overly complex. It sometimes amazes me, as a matter of fact, that we have so many people interested in alchemy today. The reason being that there are other systems of approach that are much more effective, much simpler, and that in a sense the person who's going after alchemy is picking the most difficult of all records of spiritual fulfillment to follow. This is kind of a strange situation to be in, to say this, because I've been saying in the last few lectures the same thing about the Kabbalah. But the Kabbalah looks fabulous next to alchemy. It's much simpler and much more effective and just tremendously richer in a sense and less confusing. So alchemy is really our arcane, strange approach to these things. And it's the same in China or India, wherever we find records of it. It could perhaps be suggested that it is a field that appeals to those who have a strange combination of minds. They like researching. They've got strong intellects that they want to be working constantly on complex puzzle-like problems. And then perhaps there's a little bit of greed way down in there with the idea of just maybe this stuff works and we really can get some gold out of it. That would be fun. Never admitted, of course. But nevertheless, as a system of mythology, it's most interesting. And there is one myth in particular I want to bring to your attention, as I think it's the most important symbolic piece in the entire history of alchemy, and it reappears all the time. And that is how it comes to be that the alchemist, after 40 or 50 years of struggle, finally finds the correct formula. Now, these fellows went through incredible trouble. Of course, as we know, they had to keep things secret. Then they had to go digging around for books that they could find. Now, some of them would say that they went out by a certain church and they found a certain book jammed in a certain wall by a certain monk, that sort of thing. And it's perhaps possible that that story was used to cover the fact that they themselves had authored the book and didn't want to take credit for it at the risk of being burned or something. Others went and chased down alchemical masters, and the histories of alchemy, the history of alchemy is full of really heart-rending stories of individuals who meant well, spent a fortune repeatedly with masters who were masters of only one thing, and that was getting money out of these people. And as a result, died poverty-stricken and penniless and heartbroken and that sort of stuff. But every once in a while, you ran into somebody who that didn't happen to. Nicholas Flamel was one example, and I am leading up to this myth. Nicholas Flamel and his wife, Purnell, had the one really beautiful life in the history of alchemy. It's the only one that really stands out and that alchemists love to quote. They just cherish it. It's the, yes, it could be done, it could happen to you. The idea was that Nicholas was one of the few people who could read in Paris at that time, and he was in a bookstall and found a book of curious diagrams that was attributed to Abraham the Jew. He and his wife spent years trying to figure these things out and couldn't. Finally, Nicholas said, I can't stand it anymore, I've got to know. I'm going to go to Spain where there's a large Jewish community, and perhaps I can find somebody who will tell me what these things mean. So he went to Spain, and he found himself a wonderful old Jewish rabbi who said, yes, I will tell you what they mean. And as they were journeying back to Paris, the rabbi died without having revealed the secret. Told him enough, though, that when Nicholas came back with a few more years of hard work, he and his wife figured out the Philosopher's Stone. And then we have a record in Parisian history of their building churches and hospitals by the dozens and leaving little alchemical figures on all of them. And eventually they died, and we have wonderful, mysterious stories about how years later an envoy of the French king was traveling in the east in one of the Arabic nations, and he ran into an Arab, a Sufi, who was
fluent in all European languages, and who, when he heard the name Nicholas Flamel, said, "Oh yes, Nicholas Flamel, he's a great friend of mine." And the king's envoy said, "Well, how could he be a friend of yours? He died 100 years ago." "Oh, no. That was all just staged to get him out of there. He's been living in the East with his wife for a long time now." And so it's a lovely mythical ending to it. But his story includes an element that reappears in almost all the alchemical tales and also appears in Sufi mythology. So here could be a connection between the Arab originations of alchemy and the actual tradition itself. And that was that when you were finally too tired to go on, when you dragged on for 20, 30 years, exhausting every resource to discover the truth, to become enlightened, one day, perhaps when you prayed with special earnestness, when you wanted to know this more than life itself, there appeared to you the great adept. And he was in a blue cape or a green cape. In the Sufi traditions, he appears in a green cape. And he reveals the missing component. Usually it's just a word. One little word. Or he draws a little diagram, and that's it. Leaves, and then you suddenly look at the diagram and say, "That's it!" And then it opens up all the little doors, and suddenly you're enlightened. Now, I would suggest to you that rather than thinking that this is an apparition or it's one of the Brotherhood of Initiates popping into somebody's house and saying, "Oh, well, we've taken mercy on you, and here's a great wisdom that you've been too stupid to discover," that actually what's being described here is an experience. It's put into terms of a human being in a certain colored cloak and that sort of thing as an effort of symbology. If you take it apart, what you discover is that the color blue in particular has always been associated with wisdom because of the sky, that aspect. And the color green has also been associated with wisdom because of nature. This natural world in alchemy is considered to be a full expression of God's wisdom. Thomas Paine's remark that the only book about religion that could never be amended and wiped out and destroyed and mangled by human beings was the Book of Nature. And of course he didn't live long enough to see it happen. But that idea was very alchemical. If you looked at nature, if you really understood it, you could understand God. You could understand spiritual processes. So here we have a man representing masculine energy, that kind of force impressing itself on you, makes an appearance, always described as appearing in a blinding flash of light. There was smoke and flames and that sort of stuff. And if you have had a mystical experience, you recognize that one right away. And so perhaps what we have here is a record of some poor gentleman who spent 20 or 30 years belaboring his alchemical texts, and one day, click, it all opened up. And usually, when people have these experiences, they say one thing about them. They say, "I had nothing to do with it. It was grace." You feel humble afterwards. You don't say, "I did it. I finally got enlightened." You just say, "I know I didn't do it because I was going down the wrong track for the 30th time and suddenly it just happened." And so you have these stories of the adept showing up and in the kindness of his heart giving the secret formula that was missing, the one word. Sometimes it's said to be Eitzah. In other words, everything is God. Now, it's interesting to speculate that this is an idea that reaches particularly full expression in Sufism. In Sufism we have the tradition of individuals, Sufi masters, coming out and saying such things as, "I am Allah, I am God," and then promptly being burned at the stake for it. But they were quite conscious that they were going to be burned at the stake, and they were quite conscious that they were leaving a message all the way down through history, because stake burnings and people saying, "I am God," tend to be recorded in history books with particular glee. The meaning was not that they personally were God. The meaning was that they had discovered that God and they were one, and that was true of all human beings. In fact, it was true of all being. And this is the very same idea that we have in Eitzah. The idea is that the life force is none other than God. And that life force is not simply energy. It's not simply the difference between a dead thing and a live one. It's also form and color and motion and all those elements, even spatiality, all of it. And the idea is also added thereonto, especially by the Sufis, that this is only one station, one particular dimensional level of this God's existence, where it happens to have this peculiar triune quality, three-dimensional quality. There are other dimensional levels that are quite different, that are quite more dramatic, and these have been described in the Tibetan Bardo Thudal and other texts on after-death experiences and altered states and that sort of thing. And it's also suggestible that when a person takes an hallucinogenic drug, that they are experiencing these other dimensions or other states, thinking that it is a warping of the mind, when what actually happens is that the mind's warping opens up an awareness of these states without preparation, and as a result there can be all kinds of unpleasant experiences, or very pleasant ones, for that matter. So, when we look at the alchemical tradition, I might add that there's almost no contact between the Kabbalah and alchemy. You do have such people as Eliphas Levi who study alchemy and Kabbalah and tarot and astrology, and they mix it all together to get the wisdom out of it. But you do not have an alchemist per se who is a Kabbalist, and who leaves us a record of his researches combined. It's a rather strange thing that it's only the encyclopedist occultists, we can put it that way, the ones who wrote about a vast number of subjects, who deal with both. Specialists in either field tend not to touch the other. Kabbalists rarely write about alchemy. Alchemists never, as far as we know, have written about Kabbalah. Reasons seem strange because we do have a Jewish tradition in alchemy, and one might think that there would be an approach to these. But if you think about it for a moment, there's quite a bit of difference in the temperaments associated with these two approaches. The alchemist really did want to mess around with these alembics and crucibles and things. The idea was not that you were a theoretical alchemist, that you just thought about these things. You really did have to get into the laboratory and mix some of this stuff around just to get a feeling for the way nature works, chemical differences and combinations and that sort of thing. That was part of the alchemical procedure. So this was a kind of hands-on process. Kabbalah, on the other hand, had not been for centuries much of a hands-on process. At one time it had a ceremonial tradition that was quite similar to ceremonial magic. But in the most, let's say, central, middle stream Kabbalistic traditions, it was said about, I think, 1700 years ago that the time for that kind of magic was gone. The world had become too chaotic. Certain astrological and, let's just say, cosmic configurations no longer made it possible to safely practice magic. Therefore, that side of the tradition was closed down. There were two sides left, however. That was the meditative aspect of Kabbalah, which was similar to the magical, only didn't use actual ritual implements, but also attempted to invoke certain angelic presences for which you can read states of consciousness, by use of the tree as a meditative tool, or permutations of the Hebrew alphabet, that kind of thing. And then finally you had a purely theoretical Kabbalah that was very intellectual. There was really old, bewhiskered Hebrew rabbis arguing about how many Sephiroth there were and how they should be combined and what their real names were and what it all meant. And they would take apart the first 30 words in Genesis and write 6,000-page books about what those words meant Kabbalistically, which are wonderfully suggestive. So you can see that this is a different kind of approach than alchemy. It's not as interested in physical experimentation. Also, Kabbalists in general were not interested in physical results. They really didn't care about providing the world with a great medicine or a means to produce gold. It has to be mentioned that many of the Kabbalists who were interested in gold and who we know were very spiritually oriented had the idea that if you could figure out how to make gold, just at will, you could end a great deal of the greed in this world. You could really stop a great deal of the slavery and suffering because you could produce as much of the stuff as people could want. They didn't really think that they'd probably find something else to use to be greedy about, but nevertheless, at least get rid of gold. And of course, again, the medical approach. Now, this medical approach has a very interesting relation to Rosicrucianism, which I'll touch for a moment. Again, mentioning Paracelsus, who may have been involved in the Rosicrucian movement. Rosicrucianism is riddled with controversy and confusion. There are some, like Paul Foster Case, who make a very convincing argument that Rosicrucianism was a symbolical approach. That if you understand the numerology and the Hebraic characters involved in such books as the Fama and even in the Chemical Marriage, what you discover is that this is a story of spiritual processes, very Kabbalistic in nature, and that it is not intended to be taken as literal history. He did feel that there was a brotherhood that had this information and that was politically active and spiritually active, but it was basically a kind of mythologized doctrine, a mythologized mysticism. There are others who feel that the Rosicrucian Brotherhood was a group of adepts, of very highly developed beings who guided the development of European culture of the Renaissance that freed Northern Europe and England from the influence of the Catholic Church and thus made it possible for America to be founded as a free nation where there could be an experiment in liberty and democracy. And then, of course, there are others who feel that Rosicrucianism was a political movement, that the Catholic Church had the Jesuits and the Protestants had the Rosicrucians, and both were kind of super intellectual planners who got in there and confused issues for politicians and priests and that sort of thing to fight a kind of covert battle, sort of spiritual secret agents. We don't know what the truth of the matter is. The Rosicrucian symbology is beautiful, very mystical. In short, you have a cross and a rose with thorns vining upon it. Now that if you take the cross to represent the four cardinal points, or Yod, Hey, Vav, Hey, or any of the basic quaternary, then what you have is the cross is an image of materialized spirit, or of the material world. Then you have the spiral, the vine moving up the cross with its thorns, representative of the experience of life. Through suffering, we always rise. You might also note the thorns get smaller as you go up. They're not quite as difficult as long as you're going up. And finally, we get to the blossom of the rose, which is suggestive of the thousand-petaled lotus in the Hindu tradition, or of enlightenment, or of mystical love, or again, the Christ experience. Paul Foster Case and many others have suggested that the rosy cross was a mystical experience, as opposed to just a simple literal symbol. But in other words, these were a group of people who had a vision of a certain type, a vision of a rosy-like radiance with these four like star-like points of light, and that this was the way that they described it. Quite possible. But one of the things that was said about the Rosicrucians, particularly in the laws of the order, was that these should be doctors. They should be medical practitioners who worked for free. Now that can be taken literally, or it can mean that they went around healing people spiritually. But nevertheless, there was this emphasis on medicine. And again, in so much of alchemy, we have an emphasis on medicine. And finally, in some of the Rosicrucian tracts, we find that there is a kind of chemical terminology. One of the most important of the tracts, Chemische Hochzeit, the chemical marriage, in its very title is alchemical. And although there isn't too much alchemical stuff going on the surface in the story, if you begin to reduce that story and its kings and queens and princesses and all of that, you discover very quickly that this is now chemical symbology. So what does that all mean? It could mean that alchemy was a branch of the Rosicrucian effort, that it was a way of freeing the sciences in a sense. And it's rather interesting to speculate then that eventually there will be a return to the understanding that men like Paracelsus had, that the sciences, medicine, all of them, chemistry, have a spiritual side. This is very similar to the phenomenological school of philosophy today that is arguing that you really cannot separate the human consciousness from its efforts. So therefore, the idea of a purely objective scientific consciousness is false. That there is always a projection of self into any scientific experiment, and by not recognizing it, you merely confuse matters. So it could be said when you look at modern physics and such books as The Dancing Woolly Masters and all that, Galaphysics, that we are moving slowly toward an appreciation that once again, as above, so below, that an understanding of physical and chemical realities can help us spiritually. And we will come back and talk about more practical things after a short break.
Is that in our culture, with our particular tuning, attention is something we don't understand very well. We don't understand that attention is a need, just like sexual need or hunger or any other needs. And we need to give our attention, and we need to also get attention. There has not been a single lecture that I've given where I've not had at least one person in the audience for a good length of time who I know is here simply because they want to pay attention to something. They have no idea what I'm talking about. They don't really care. They just want to pay attention. They need to. And there are always people, then again, who go out and think that they're falling in love or that they are performing or giving a lecture for that matter. And what they're really doing is saying, please pay attention to me. I need to have some attention. As a result of this misunderstanding of attention, we get sucked up into glamorous ideas of spiritual development. And glamorous ideas don't work unless they're built on a strong foundation of personal practice. So let's discuss that personal practice for a moment. What we're talking about is transmutation. That is, changing one thing into something else, and transcending, in a sense, also. I'll use an example out of astrology to begin with. If you have dabbled in astrology, you have undoubtedly already heard of the fearsome Mercury retrograde. You probably have friends who call you up at certain intervals and say, oh, God, everything's awful. It's Mercury retrograde, 3 weeks of hell, that sort of thing. And you may find yourself at various times, either through their influence or your own cupidity, discovering that, yes, indeed, Mercury retrograde is an awful time, and it's just terrible, and this and that. Well, one approach to Mercury retrograde is to say to yourself, okay, let's assume that there really is a kind of energy focus at that time that is potentially harmful and painful and is just basically a pain to deal with. What can we do with it? Well, you ask yourself, what does Mercury retrograde mean? Well, in astrology, Mercury retrograde, in one sense, refers to the process of, in a sense, going over our assumptions, going over our decisions and our mental habits, and thinning them out, discovering what we no longer need. It's, in a sense, a time for solitude and a time to dig deeper into ourselves and to clarify, to divest ourselves of things we don't need. So, for example, it's a good time to go through your library and decide, well, I read that book, I'll never read it again, get rid of it. And this book over here, forget it, I'm never going to read it. Never have, never will. Get rid of that one. But this one I really do want to read, and I should make an effort to read it. I'll read it next week, that sort of thing. You may never get to it and throw it out 6 weeks later in another Mercury retrograde or something, or 6 months rather. But nevertheless, you make these kinds of decisions. That's a kind of transmutation of that energy. You work with it. You try to discover the way it wants to be applied. The root assumption here is that all energies human beings have to deal with are basically good, are basically beautiful, are meant to be beneficial. But we have the ability to abuse them by blocking them, basically. So, for example, when faced with a Mercury retrograde, the idea that we should calm down, maybe not travel around so much, but just get a basic idea of where we stand, in a sense, take stock of ourselves. Instead, we go full speed ahead. We don't want to be stopped by that. And we run into such things as flat tires and airplane crashes and all sorts of wonderful, typical Mercury retrograde extreme phenomenon. Instead, you say, why block the energy? If the energy is moving me toward discovering more about myself, towards periods of self-introspection, well, by all means, exercise introspection. Similarly, in our own natures, there are parts of ourselves that we block. On the spiritual path, you quickly learn that you have to look into the faces of all the monsters, all the demons and angels inside. You need to see them. You've got to recognize that they're there. And once you have done that, you can see who they are behind that mask of fright or attractiveness, and then provide them with a proper place in your little play, the play of your life. You realize that they're there. There's virtually no impulse that cannot be redirected into some positive sense. Now let's give an example here. If you are a person who has an extremely destructive temperament when frustrated, this is the person who breaks bottles and throws tables and breaks windows and that sort of stuff, and tends to get in a lot of car accidents during certain times in their lives, and simply has this sense of destruction around them, and can be often quite cruel also with words, can turn to people and really slash them to bits when they're angry at them, that sort of thing. Now you might think to yourself, well, that kind of destructive energy has absolutely no good use. And yet you have to try and understand it as symbolism. So what does it mean when a person gets frustrated and angry and starts breaking things? Well, the first thing is, obviously, they want to break the obstacles. And it's more intelligent to look at the obstacle and figure out how to break it than to break some replacement for it that doesn't do you any good anyway. But beyond that, there are more personal symbologies at work, and they would include, what is it that you decided to break? The idea here is that there are not accidents. There are none. That if you are breaking the thing that's closest at hand, nevertheless, there's some symbology involved in it. See what it is that you're breaking. Try and discover what you are symbolizing to yourself. And then again, realize that very likely what you are symbolizing is something that you want to divest yourself of, or some aspect of yourself you're afraid of. An example might be, and this is just an example because there should be 1,000 different interpretations of this particular action. Let's say you grab a vase and you smash it. And let's say that that vase came to you by way of your mother-in-law, and that it happens to be empty at the time that you break it. Now, there's several levels there. One thing you may be showing yourself is that a vase is very receptive. It's very yin. Its use is in holding things, in a sense. And it is very possible that you are symbolizing your rejection of that aspect of yourself. You refuse to accept things, to be passive in the face of frustration. So you break that part of yourself. And then again, there may be some association with your mother-in-law there, or with the design on the vase. But think about it for a moment when those kinds of things happen, and you very often get a little message to yourself. When you discover what the message is, you then try to take that energy and apply it constructively. So if you discover that you are breaking things that were given to you at a certain period in your life, this is simply telling you that you need to divest yourself of the emotional clusters you developed at that time. So you work on that very directly. Perhaps you get rid of the objects themselves from that period. If you find that this has something to do with a certain personality trait that you have, for instance, that you reject passivity, you turn the destructive urge, which is really, and here's the key to this, a critical urge that is expressed in a violent physical manner. You turn that critical urge inward or at the world around you to try and understand. So instead of breaking, instead of destroying, you try to break things apart internally. Break them apart externally to understand them better, to see how they're put together, how they function. A very alchemical kind of process. Alchemy divided, usually into 12 parts, the process of transmutation. And I'm not going to go into them now. If you're interested, you'll seek them out. They appear in a very clear way in the Most Holy Trinosophia of Saint Germain. They appear also in Mr. Hall's Secret Teachings of All Ages in the alchemical section. But these have such words as projection, and all represent energies that can be applied in various ways. And it can be very educative if you look into those different words, see what they mean, and then ask yourself, well, how do they apply to my personal life? And how can they be misapplied? How can you do this wrong, in other words? How can you misuse the energy that dissolves things, for example? Look into that, and then you begin to work with it. Transmutation of energy is basic to the concept of enlightenment as we have it from yoga. And there we find it in the system of the Kundalini, the chakras. The idea here being that you refine the central energy, the energy of the Kundalini goddess, and it rises up into these different dimensional levels of being that are symbolized by the chakras. And so, using the usual 7, although there have been literally hundreds of different attributions in terms of numbers, 7 being the most popular, you can look at the world 7 different ways. You can live in 7 different worlds, in a sense. You start out with the lowest chakra, and that can be understood as a kind of very Saturnian. It's the world where things are broken down, decayed, expulsion, very low plutonic vibrational energies. These are people who, in a sense, look around and see that the world is nothing but soiled. It's all dirt. It's all useless. It's all ugly. It's all waste, that kind of thing. Now, you can see that positively, too. You can have a kind of Shiva experience and look at the world and see it all as transforming and say, yes, it is all waste, but it's all giving off life as well, and it's quite beautiful in that sense. But if you're focused primarily on the waste aspect, then you're focused down on the lowest chakra. And you rise up the 7 levels, and they associate with the parts of the bodies, of course, that they're associated with, until you eventually come to the 1,000-petaled lotus, and this is the opening of full enlightenment. You can kind of picture a great sun suddenly blazing at the top of your head, that sort of thing. Suddenly you see. And it's the light inside you, not just the light outside. Transmutation is constantly with us. It's something that we need to be working on, and it's a great tragedy, I think, of our culture that there is not enough attention to it. Many of the fields of psychology that we have today do not focus on this aspect of change, do not focus on the tremendous power that the individual has for transformation, that you can simply decide you're going to improve yourself. You work on it. And the way you do it is very gently. You don't decide, that's it, from this day forward I will never, ever again lose my temper. There are some people who do that and succeed, but the vast majority don't. The vast majority immediately lose their temper at the first opportunity, maybe the second if they're really strict about it. The idea is to taper down, to be gradual. And the way you taper down is to start to replace the vicious expression of the energy with a virtuous one. And again, what we mean by vicious is not sinful, but crooked. And what we mean by virtuous is not holy and sacred and Christian and all that, but it's virtue in the sense of full of life, full of force. Because the problem is that when we express these energies in crooked ways, they lose some of their force. The process of transmutation is a kind of evolution, physiological in a sense. Imagine for a moment that you as a being are energy, all the way through, body, soul, mind, energy. And you have this incredible spectrum of energies. As Emerson pointed out, there's no place where you draw a line and say, I end here and God starts there. That's the line. This just goes on and on and on and on infinitely. You really can't tell. You sort of just disappear into the God consciousness. So as you rise on these various levels, the spectrums, it's kind of like you might picture a railroad and a train traveling on it. In fact, even better, picture a child's railroad set, and you, standing over it, can kind of move this train wherever you like. As a result, you see so much track to either side, as if you were on a train. And where you focus is what vibrational spectrum you will be aware of. So, for example, we've got Hindu yogis who refine their energies and who then tell us that they see all sorts of things. They tell you what your past lives are. They know what their past lives are. They tell you what's going to happen and what's not going to happen and all this sort of kind of glamorous, exciting stuff. But unquestionably, they are able to perform these kinds of feats of knowledge, let's call it. They seem to be aware of another spectrum of energy. Many psychics also are doing the same sort of work. So you have examples of people who you may go to tell you all about your family, even though you haven't told them anything about it. Or you have examples of such people as Sri Ramana Maharshi, who are asked complicated questions about Einsteinian physics, and who give perfect answers without ever having been exposed to any form of that physics. They simply understand the root basis of it. They've looked into that part of life. Most of us focus in at a certain level that can be said to especially focus on our material concerns. These can be concerns for shelter, these can be sexual concerns, they can be concerns for food, all these sorts of things. Prestige gets in there. And these tend to be the principal levels of focus in our culture. Now, as a result, when you have your train set on that particular part of the track, people consider you normal. You may have grown up your whole life with a feeling that that was the only real part of the track, that anything above it was hallucination, was false, couldn't possibly exist. And then you perhaps run into people, you're fortunate enough to meet people, who do live in other parts of this track. They have different perceptions than you do. They see different things. They have different faculties, much more sensitive. And they can be quite astonishing because of that. The only difference between them and you is that they have focused their energy in this different place. Their attention is focused there. They have transmuted or refined their energies. Now, this is easily explained in terms of Neoplatonism, a lot of Christian mysticism, perhaps most clearly in Buddhism and in Vedanta, the idea being that you have a physical matrix of experience, life in the physical body, and you have your mental matrix of experience, and you have your spiritual matrix of experience, and all of these have a tremendous spectrum of, or a tremendous range, let's say, of sensations. If you focus on the physical, it's of all these the most limiting, the most gross, it's been described. Not to mean disgusting, but to mean heavy, weighty, kind of sticky. The Neoplatonists used to use the word mud. And the Neoplatonists, again, used to say that what happens to souls is they incarnate and they become fascinated with this stuff. It's almost as though you've got a sea of marbles in front of you, and they're all glittering with light, and you throw your hand across them, and they all change. And every movement you make in the world is like that, every thought. And so you become fascinated with this stuff down here. But as a result, you are not focused inside, and you lose touch with a great many faculties that are naturally yours. And these bring in clairvoyance and clairaudience and all that sort of thing. And even more simply attention, more refined attention. So I'd like to focus on one aspect of transmutation now, having to do with attention, and that is learning to really be aware of other people. Most of us do the opposite. Maybe it's school, maybe it's parents, maybe it's just the nature of the culture, the rush that we're all in a sense. But most of us develop a way of dealing with people. We ask the bare minimum of questions. We avoid, as much as possible, getting into any real discussion with most people, even people we like. We simply do what's enough to be friendly, to keep it open. Perhaps we get an interesting tidbit or two, and we drop it right there. Only a little bit of our attention is focused on the person. We may at the same time be thinking about what we're going to do after the lecture, or the laundry we forgot, or the fact that we didn't do the dishes or we did do them. All this other stuff is going on. Or we see somebody on the other side of the room that we really want to talk to, so we hardly pay attention to this person, that sort of thing. Big mistake. Because it's a kind of division of your energies. Branching away of them weakens them. If you're with a particular person or in a particular situation at a particular time, pay attention to it. Learn to really listen, to really see, so that your focus is there. One of the most striking things that people used to say about Albert Einstein was that he had a way of looking at you when you spoke to him like a child. He was fascinated by what you were saying. You could be talking to him about the dullest, most mundane thing. But he just listened. It was like he was drinking in the words. And you might say that that level of absorption is what enabled him to come up with a theory of relativity. He was able to focus that deeply into his other work. And of course, that's the trick here. If you can learn to focus that deeply in social matters, you can learn to focus that deeply in all your studies, spiritual, artistic, practical, whatever they might be. This is the trick of Zen. To be able to focus your attention, your consciousness on what you're doing at the time as completely as possible. To be clear-headed. This isn't easy to do. We have a lot of excuses in our minds for why we can't do it. We tell ourselves, for example, I don't have time. I mean, if I listened to everybody in the world, I'd never get anything done. But you really do have time, because the next thing you learn is to express yourself, to be honest. So give a person 3 minutes of undivided attention and then say, I have to leave now, I'm terribly sorry, and leave. But at least for those few minutes that you've decided to give the person, really pay attention. Now, some examples. If you've ever been interested in apparitions and that sort of thing, ghosts, you've heard about smells. You know, that people smell, or it's cold, and there's a smell of flowers in the room, and that's when the apparition is seen, that sort of thing. And a lot of people walk around reading about this stuff, and they think, I would love to see an apparition. It'd be just be great to know that those things are for real. But what they don't realize is that apparitions are going on all the time around them, because apparitions are not something entering into this. We have many dimensions working here. There's all kinds of things to see and hear and smell. You have to be able to pay attention to them. And 99% of the people in the world wouldn't notice if the whole room suddenly started smelling of roses. It just never occurred to them. Or they might think, it must be the carpet cleaner, Never really occurs to them to pay attention to the nuances of these things. Diet is an excellent example of this. People who go to nutritionists or who have various tests done as to their allergies, or who go to psychics who prescribe nutritionally, are often shocked to discover the things they like best are precisely the things they're not supposed to eat. And they say, well, why is that? Shouldn't we have some natural form of guidance that will tell us not to eat this stuff because it's bad for us? The answer is you do, but you don't pay attention to it. For instance, maybe you're allergic to chicken, and you stuff your face with chicken at dinner, and you just don't really feel well afterwards. Maybe you feel a little bit oily, a little bit woozy, your mind gets a little bit hazy. You just think, well, I just ate. Period. That's a message to you, perhaps, that you shouldn't be eating this stuff. What do you want? To grow 3 noses and have your hair fall out and stuff? And then you say, aha, now I know I'm allergic to this. It's very subtle things. Very subtle things. So you have to look then for these nuances in yourself. And then add to that something especially interesting, and that is, if you get into yoga or you get into any kind of spiritual practice, alchemical, Kabbalistic, you have very interesting experiences, and they are very subtle. And most people have them all the time, but don't notice them. And they are like this. If you do the breath of fire, when you breathe in and out very fast and very deeply, this puts you out into a very interesting state of consciousness. And occasionally you suddenly feel like, boy, this stuff isn't real. The body and all this stuff, it's mental projection. The stuff is not real in the way that we think it is. It's absolutely clear to you in sensation and in appearance. But you don't notice it 9 times out of 10 because it's weird. You think to yourself, I'm getting lightheaded. Pay attention to all those sensations. Pay attention to what comes to you, as Art pointed out in an earlier lecture, in the twilight state, just before you fall asleep. Sometimes those are very luminous, very important experiences. It can teach you a great deal about things. And until you bring a little attention onto that side, the twilight side, you can't bring light into it. You can't make it visible to you. Now that same attention to nuances can be used with other people. And one example that I can give is this is a very basic one, you have your psychics of a certain ilk, that's the really good word for it, who do this sort of thing. They walk up to you and they say, you have a daughter. And you say, no, I don't. Do you have a niece? No, I don't have a niece. Well, you know a small girl. No, I don't know a small girl. Well, you're soon going to meet a small girl. Now, I heard that one. I didn't make that up. And there were people very impressed by this psychic. Now, that's a certain level of this kind of activity. But on a less gross level, and we do mean disgusting this time, you also have the kind of person, very often Zen Roshis are like this, Sufi teachers are very often like this, who can simply read posture, the way your hair is, what you're dressing like, the colors, especially if they see you over a period of time, they can simply compare how it changes each time. And if they're totally receptive to this, it tells them a tremendous amount about you. It's not that they have a little book about body language and they go in there and say, if you've got your legs crossed, that means it depends on you as an individual. But as they see you over a period of time, they begin to read these things. So I, for example, as a lecturer, and I don't do this so don't get nervous, but if I wanted to, I could watch each of you and see how your body gestures change according to what I'm talking to at a given moment. Tell me a great deal about you. I could look at how your dress changes, your clothing changes. Is your hair a little bit different? Perhaps when you seem tired and you only respond to this certain aspect of a lecture, you wear dark colors. It tells me something right away. So you see, there's a tremendous amount of knowledge available to us at any moment. But most of us are too distracted with garbage, with just space junk, in a sense, floating around in our minds, to really appreciate that. And the beauty of all this attention is not just that you become much more functional in the world, much wiser, but also that it opens up something that might be called love. It opens up a sense of wonder. This is the Zen state. Because when you really look at somebody, you really listen to them, you're just flooded by the wonder of it all. You just go into this sort of state of mind like a child where you think, it's just so marvelous. I mean, listen to this person and look at them, and it's just so full of life and vividness and variety. People who are bored are unaware, very sleepy human beings, because the tremendous variety, the just astonishing, overpowering beauty of this world and of the creations of the mind throughout history and imagination and on and on and on and on and on. Staggering, absolutely staggering. And each very much like the others and yet also different. And this is where a lot of the sense of wonder comes from. That you look at another person and you see yourself and people you love written all over them. And yet they're very different in their own ways. And this combination of sameness and difference is a truly wondrous thing. Now, Swedenborg, who was a really tremendous individual, I think he really was a psychic, if you want to put it honestly, but had just phenomenal visions, and I recommend to anyone having relationship troubles or wishing to develop a great relationship his book on conjugal love, which is just a tremendous, tremendous piece of work. Swedenborg used to say, and says constantly in that book, as a matter of fact, that what you need to do to really be in heaven is to take love and wisdom and combine them into use. Now, that's really what we're talking about here. In a sense, first of all, these lead to each other, because if you are wise, that means you are open, you are attentive, you are aware, and that leads you to this experience of wonder and this experience of how people are common in their suffering, how they are like you. You feel empathy. Love develops as you see that you and other people are really one being. You feel this perhaps even with stones and crystals and animals and plants and all sorts of stuff. Love, on the other hand, leads to wisdom, because if you truly love someone, you're very attentive to them. You try to match their needs, the unspoken needs. You become selfless, and selflessness is true wisdom. Now, use gets in there immediately. How? Quite simply. Because if you're really paying attention to somebody, and you really love them, you really care about them, that is the perfect combination. The love means you want to help them, and the wisdom gives you the means to do so. Your selflessness means that you're not misguiding them because you are actually involved in some own project of your own that you really use people to achieve. You may not be aware of it. If you really love, if you're really wise, you're selfless, you don't do that. And if you really observe them, then you know just the things to say and do, because there's very much inside you the same things that are inside them. And these are the keys to the situation. But this requires a tremendous amount of attention. Now, you may think that that is terribly difficult. Usually when we think of that, when we say really pay attention to somebody, we think, oh, Lord, that's so tiring. And most of the reason we think that has a simple word to describe it, and that is school. At school you were told, pay attention. And the stuff you had to pay attention to was horribly boring in most cases. And as a result, you learned that attention equates with boredom and exhaustion. Not true. As a matter of fact, distraction is exhausting. The usual state of distraction that we move around in is what depletes our energies. Because we are focused on three things at once, we don't accomplish any of them, and we get tired. A good experiment is, if you have some task that you're not particularly interested in doing, perhaps it's some form of filing or something, instead of doing what you may do, the average strategy, which is, while I'm filing, I'm going to be thinking about the World Series or that sort of thing. And you make mistakes, of course, and then the boss gets angry and all that. Instead, think, I'm really going to focus on filing. I'm really going to try this. I'm going to focus on the words. I'm going to play with it. I'm going to see what the order of the filing is. I'm really going to try and get into the motions involved. At the very least, I'm going to try and get a very Zen or yoga-like movement going. See if I can get a cycle, a kind of moving meditation as I do this, that sort of thing. In other words, use all these activities by focusing on them and finding some usefulness in them for your self-development. So, for example, Sufis, very often when they have new students, especially from the West, because students from the West tend to come out there into Islam and say, boy, teach me all that great stuff, and are not prepared at all. As one rather caustic Sufi mystic said, you don't even know how to breathe. How can you know anything about God? Now, it's perhaps partially true, but it was certainly a good way to get him free of this particular enthusiastic acolyte. Now, very often, instead of giving them these beautiful doctrines, meditations, they'll say, all right, I want you to pay attention to every step you take. I want you to see where you lay your foot down and do it consciously. I want you to be aware of lifting your foot. When you brush your teeth, I want you to be aware of every tooth, of every motion of the brush, of how you lay the glass down. And then, of course, Sufism is famous for making its students learn a particular craft, making copper plates or making rugs, that sort of thing. And the idea here again is you've got to be aware of every motion as you do this. And of course, as you become aware of the motion, the idea is if you harmonize the motions, you get a kind of dance going. You begin to see that there's a center, as they say in the martial arts, of your gravity, and that you can work around that center. That there's a kind of economy of motion. You get into all this sort of thing. Now, even a little bit of attention on this, just a little bit, has dramatic results. It really does open up all kinds of changes. Because the principal problem that most of us have to deal with is not ignorance because mystical and spiritual matters are so dazzling and blinding. They are. But after all, they're the reason we're here. We're here to learn apperceptions of them, as well as learning patience and service and those things. But also, it is because we are distracted and focused on other things. And in our culture, those other things tend to be stereotypes. You pick out a period or a person or an art form, perhaps, and you identify with it very powerfully. You read the books from that period. You listen to its music. You arrange your home so that it looks like it. Some of you have walked into homes, perhaps in Beverly Hills, that look like the Palace of Louis. Everything's gold and ornate and all this kind of stuff. And these people are not living in the 20th century. They're into a very kind of court style of life. In metaphysics, we all know people who live very much in 19th century fashion. They like that kind of thing. They only have candles in the house, no electric light for me, it's disgusting. That sort of thing. Each of us has this. We have Jewish fellows who have Japanese homes and Japanese fellows who have Jewish homes and that sort of thing, depending on what appeals to them. That's fine, but be conscious of it and beware of being locked into a stereotype. Because what you think may be comforting to you, what you think is the right way to go, is very often a trap that you've dug for yourself. And the way you tell if it is a trap is if you become very depressed by it. In other words, your energies cease. And this goes on for a long period of time. Recurrent, very destructive and devitalizing. That is a sure indication that you are locked into a stereotype. Now, if you add, moving away from eras, stereotypes having to do with sports or a particular career, lawyers or doctors, the kind of cliques that we sometimes see, or professors, that sort of thing, you can see that people get lost in these masks that they build for themselves. The fact is that you're here right now, and you may not like the airplanes and the architecture and the noise and all that, but guess what? It's yours. Enjoy it. Work with it. Make it work for you. Discover the beauty in it. For example, there are in India Bengali bards. Do not belong to any particular tradition. They pull from Sufism and from Hinduism equally. They sing absolutely beautiful songs. They're like troubadours in a sense. And you might think that they would be full of stuff about how vile modern culture is. What you find instead is that they're singing these great mystical love songs about airplanes and stuff like that, because they think airplanes are great symbols of spiritual doctrine, because you take your luggage up there, and your luggage gets put in back, and you go up in the air, and you wind up somewhere completely different, that sort of thing. They look at everything around them, and they say, great symbol, wonderful. That's what we need to do. You need to stop complaining about the situation, work to improve it, certainly, but also make use of what's here. So, for example, you sometimes hear complaints from people who cannot get published. They say, I cannot write. I write this stuff, and I can't get anybody to publish it, and it's because the publishing companies are rotten and that sort of thing. And what they don't think is, new fields opening up. Video, big field. Sidney Omar, for example, has already flooded the video market with his astrological cassettes. There's a smart little Uranian personality. Figured it out quick. Because very shortly, science, as it has been doing in the last few decades, will continue to transform our lives radically. And it's very likely that between the computer and all sorts of little gravitational and nuclear tricks that are coming up, not to mention genetics and all that, the face of the Earth, the face of our lives as we know them, will look very different in the next 10 or 20 years. And we need to be aware of that. There's something very strange about the way that metaphysicians seem to be the least creative and forceful of people. You find all sorts of people into strange things. American Atheists Anonymous and fundamentalist Christians and all sorts of people out there using video and television and really getting out there and talking to the kids and that sort of thing. And you find metaphysicians hiding in their 18th century caves, not making use of any of this stuff, and yet claiming to be the only enlightened ones, claiming to be the ones with a real imagination, the ones with a real life force and drive. You're getting a little bit of my lecture Sunday morning. So the idea here then is to connect with the world as it exists for us, to enjoy it, to see the beauty in it, to make use of it in positive ways. And that demands a certain amount of selflessness. It demands letting go of these pre-constructed ideas that we have. And the best way to loosen those pre-constructed ideas is through the transmutation of attitudes. Because as we work on such things as patience and kindness and sympathy for others, we open ourselves up. And we begin to look at ourselves and say, all along I thought that I was a really considerate, loving human being, and I've suddenly discovered that I'm boorish and I really don't like people. The first step is to accept that, to say, I guess that's true. Now I want to do something about it. And when you accept that, and when you see it, and sometimes there's tears involved, sometimes there's laughter, it depends on who you are, true change happens. Suddenly, whole new perceptions open up, and we get that old Sufi saying I'm going to leave you with. Actually, it's Islamic, not so much Sufi. And that is, if you take one step toward God, God takes 7 steps towards you. So each small effort is amply rewarded in terms of experience and perception. So experiment with this. Experiment with spiritual alchemy. Pick out an aspect of yourself that you feel is negative and transmute it. Work on the other thing. If you're impatient, spend this week working on patience, consciously and constantly, and on just being aware of yourself and where you are and the opportunities around you. So thank you, and I'll see you perhaps next Friday. Tuesday! Oh no!